Welcome to the Lifeboat Hour with your host, Carolyn Baker.
Everybody knows that the dice are loaded. Everybody rolls with their fingers crossed. Everybody knows the war is over. Everybody knows the good guys lost.
Welcome once again to the new Lifeboat Hour. We're podcasting today on July 4th, 2016, Independence Day, USA. You know, that celebration of that day, 1776, when some rich white men cobbled together a pretty good document that gave Americans some sense of freedom from Great Britain and supposedly structured a democratic republic. Yes, freedom for white males primarily, of course, with no mention of the more than human world. Now, it wasn't a bad document, but the so-called republic today bears little resemblance to what we think the founders had in mind. Also today, my guest, who happens to be Canadian, is celebrating Canada Day as we record this podcast on July 1st. And today, from across the pond, we're witnessing the country of our origin, the origin of our founding fathers, falling apart as it walks from the European Union and as a very chilling and burgeoning right-wing racist agenda threatens to engulf the UK and possibly spread across the continent and beyond. As if the times were not scary enough, now this. But today, I have with me a kindred spirit in the form of a Canadian woman whose work reveals uncanny similarities with mine. A few months ago, I was surfing Facebook and saw an article posted by her, read it, and nearly fell off my chair with the resonance I immediately had and felt that I needed to contact her so that she could be a guest on the new Lifeboat Hour sooner rather than later. Meanwhile, she graciously interviewed me a couple of weeks ago for her own podcast, and that interview will be aired in August. I'm talking about Deb Ozarko, that's spelled O-Z-A-R-K-O, at debozarko.com. And if you aren't familiar with her website, I would ask you to run, not walk to it, and check out the treasure trove of good things there. I'm not going to introduce her by naming degrees or books written, although we are going to talk about her new book, Unplug. And on her website, you can click on About Deb and read her story, some of which we'll be exploring today. She describes herself as, quote, a cultural revolutionary, status quo crusher, wannabe dancer, Ironman triathlon finisher, unapologetic vegan, voracious seeker of truth, radical critical thinker, and passionate lover of life, unquote. But Deb is living a life that most listeners of the new Lifeboat Hour resonate with because she's passionate about the reality of abrupt climate change, the collapse of industrial civilization and the paradigm on which it's built, and the necessity of human beings doing the deep, spiritual, and emotional work that this time of unprecedented crisis is demanding of all of us. So without any further delay, Deb Ozarko, welcome to the new Lifeboat Hour.
Oh, thank you, Carolyn. I feel honored and I feel grateful. And I have to say that I've always enjoyed our conversations in the past, and I'm really looking forward to going deep with this one.
Well, so am I. So let's get on to it. So Deb, I think the first order of business in our conversation today is to talk about your own evolution and what brought you to the place in your life where you now stand. I know it was a long journey and you could speak about it for hours or days maybe, but can you give us a condensed version of your journey?
Sure. Yeah, it's always, the starting point is always the challenge. I think that, you know, having heard some of your shows and having a background knowledge of what your show is all about, I think I'm going to go back a little further than I do with other podcasts that I've done in the past, just to give you a solid idea of who I am and why we resonate so deeply. Because I know a little bit about your story too, and I know that you and I are both, I think we've both been cultural revolutionaries, cultural um, it, rebels, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, I have always had a deep connection with animals in the natural world right out of the womb. And my connection has always been so powerful that I feel them. Like there's no separation between us. And even though I was indoctrinated into the same paradigm of separation, which is what I call it, as everyone else, it never felt right with me. It never felt right. And so this connection that I had was strengthened by my grandparents, who had they had a 200-acre piece of property with a small log cabin, no running water, no plumbing, no heat. And I loved going there when I was a kid. The only water was we'd have to go outside and we'd have to pump it. Same thing, if we needed to go to the bathroom, we had to go out to the outhouse. And it never was a hardship for me. We had to bring in wood for the wood stove, and I loved that. I loved that way of life because I felt a deeper connection to the earth. And I learned about wild edibles and mushrooms from my grandmother, and my love of animals was nurtured by my grandfather, who taught me how to identify birds and animal calls and to look for animal tracks as well, and for no other reason than just for curiosity, because he loved nature as well. So from a very young age, I always knew that something was wrong with humanity. I could feel it, but I could never, I was too young. I couldn't articulate it. And as a result, I was a quiet and pretty shy child who had a lot of difficulty relating to humans. Now, connection with animals and with nature was easy, but that wasn't the case with humans. And I never understood how humans could hate the earth so much. I mean, really, there's no other word for it. To me, as a child, it appeared like hatred. And how people could throw garbage into lakes and rivers and streams, forests and parks and trails. I mean, it was everywhere. I just didn't understand the disconnect. So from early on in my childhood, I would single-handedly venture out into the parks and the forests and wherever I could, and I'd pick up after everyone else. And it was a constant source of grief and frustration for me. And to be quite honest, it still is to me, for me today, except that right now the problem is exponentially worse because there's more humans on the planet, and nothing has changed as far as that separation mindset is concerned. So now I find that it's even a bigger burden to bear. I think for anybody who cares, it is. And as a kid, I could never understand why humans yelled at each other, why they fought with each other, and why they said so many mean things in front of their backs, in front of or behind people's backs. I heard my parents talking about the news, and they would talk about the war and the rape and theft and bombings and domestic violence and on. And I just couldn't understand why humans were so cruel to each other. It just baffled me. And this was the hardest one for me, is I couldn't understand why humans weren't kind to animals, or why they would be okay to some animals, but not to others, why some were food and why some were pets. It was so confusing to me. And I just, who decided this? But more importantly, why did people say yes to it without ever questioning it? So when I asked my parents why some animals were pets and why some were food, the answer was something like, well, that's just the way it is. But I didn't buy into that, because I could feel as a kid that wasn't right. And I could never understand why nobody would question this cruel and absurd belief system. So even though I too am human, I found humans confusing. But most of all, the most confusing thing for me was I just couldn't understand why humans didn't care about life. And quite honestly, I never felt like one of them. And I say them because it was so foreign to me, this behavior. I felt like a different species, and sometimes I still do. And as a result, I never fit. By the time I was 6 years old, I knew that I never, ever wanted children. And my father was convinced that I'd change my mind when I got older. So he made me write it down in my childlike scrawl. And he gave in once he noticed that I wasn't going to budge on this one. And never once, ever, have I wanted a child. Actually, that got much stronger as I got older. I think from early on, I knew the burden that children were to the planet, even when I was a child myself. I also remember throwing fits with my mother. I was in tears, wailing at the top of my lungs when I just wanted to live long enough to see the end of the cruelty and the madness and bear witness to the healing of the earth. And I had no idea way back then that that statement was going to prove to be somewhat accurate. I also knew from pretty early on that my heart was in charge, and I began rejecting everything that didn't feel right. So I've always had a very deep connection to my body. And I don't really know why I was like this or why critical thought was so innate for me, but I've always questioned pretty well anything that didn't feel right or that didn't feel like truth. I mean, I was never interested in the status quo. And again, I never had language for it as a child. I just knew that it didn't feel right. I remember when you and I had our conversation, we talked about religion, and I was very fortunate that I did not grow up in a religious household. But every now and then, my parents got it in their head that we should go to church. Maybe it was a guilt thing. I don't know. My one and only church experience, I threw a hysterical tantrum for Sunday school. And I had no idea what church was or what Sunday school was, not cognitively at least, but I think deep down I must have known something. I remember crying the entire time. But somehow the only words that got through to me were, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth."
Wow.
I have no idea, but that's stuck with me. And it's been coming into my consciousness a little bit more recently. And so I've been wondering who the meek are. Ants? Roaches?
Right.
At this point. I also hated brownies, which was the precursor to Girl Guides. And same thing, I threw tantrums before every brownie night. I despised being forced to dress like everyone else and to think like everyone else. And I think I lasted 2 or 3 sessions before my mother just couldn't take it anymore. Subconsciously, I think I knew that groupthink and dogma were wrong for my really wild mind and heart. So when I say status quo crusher and cultural revolutionary and passionate lover of life on my in my description, it's really accurate.
Well, as you were talking, I was thinking that, many children and many of us as human beings have these kinds of early issues with society that just doesn't feel right. But and many people just kind of gloss that over or they repress that. But I believe that it was because of your deep connection with nature that your ancestors instilled in you that you could not ignore that. You could not gloss it over. You had to rebel.
I think that must definitely have something to do with it, because even by the age of 12, I ended my consumption of animal flesh. Mm-hmm. Because by that point, every time I looked at a piece of meat, I could actually, in my head, I could hear the screaming, I could smell the blood, and I could feel the suffering and the fear, and I just couldn't put that into my body. Mm-hmm. I couldn't stomach the brutalized flesh of animals who I know only wanted the same thing as me, life.
Right.
And my father and I really fought over that one because he was a voracious carnivore, and he played professional football for the Ottawa Rough Riders, so Canadian football. And he played at a time when they didn't carbo load, they protein loaded. And as a competitive swimmer, he would always impose his beliefs on me. He's like, before every swim meet, you have to eat meat, a piece of steak. But it would make me sick. So I just couldn't do it. And by the time I made the decision at 12, and we were at odds, we were really at odds with this one, he knew that I wasn't going to budge because he could feel that it was coming from something deep within, this deep truth within. And he also realized that I was a product of him, and he was stubborn, and I was just as stubborn, if not more so. So eventually he gave in. And, I learned then that when my heart speaks truth, nobody can stop me.
Yes.
And, and then it just kind of went on and on. It just, this was my life. I dropped out of university after 3 years when I was pressured to narrow down my field of study. Mm-hmm. I mean, I wanted to learn what interested me. It interested me, not what conformed to a particular curriculum.
Right.
And that didn't go over well either. So I just left, and I ended up traveling around Europe and the Caribbean for a couple of years, And I learned about things that matter to me: the language, history, culture, geography, relationships, and life. And eventually, I went back to college to become a copywriter, or so I thought. And I loved writing. And I think I always knew that I wanted to be a writer, but my practical mind didn't believe that I could make a living as an author. So I thought, well, maybe copywriting will be a practical way to do it. And I went into design and advertising to learn about copywriting, but I fell in love with graphic design, and I had an innate talent for that. So that's basically what my career has been for the last 26 years. But I returned to my passion for writing and just released my first book, as you previously mentioned in the introduction.
Yeah, and which we're going to be talking about a little bit later. But, in the section on your website in which you share your story, you talk about your personal transformation. So first of all, I'd like you to tell us what you mean by that word transformation, and also talk about the death of your mom and your Ironman triathlon adventure as part of the transformation. And as you mentioned, these two events, you talk about this on your website, you mentioned them as really important in your life. And you also mentioned one of my favorite words, grief, which I believe is as necessary for all of us at this time of extinction as food and water and sleep, if we're going to be authentic, compassionate, and fully alive human beings. So please feel free to elaborate.
Transformation, yeah, that's a really powerful word for me. And I think really the essence of transformation for me is it's really an awakening to more of myself. That's what transformation means to me. So essentially what it means is three things. It means a deeper, more solid internal connection to my intuitive heart, meaning for me, what that means is my true, authentic soul self. It also means a more passionate love affair with life. And it also means being totally plugged into the present moment with fewer worries about the future. I think being present is the biggest struggle for a Homo sapien. But for me, whenever I feel transformation happening in my life, it seems to bring me closer to the present moment. And that is really the essence of transformation for me. And one thing that I've learned about transformation is that it's not a one-off. When we learn to trust ourselves, meaning in my language, it means our internal guidance, our intuition. That's when we learn to say yes to ourselves. And that's not what we're taught in our culture. We're taught to be yes people to everybody else. And when we say yes to ourselves and we repeatedly follow through with that yes, our lives expand exponentially more. And that's when I learned to realize the limitlessness of who I am. So transformation really is endless. And in my life, there have been frequent pivotal moments, some that have been downright cathartic, like the death of my mother and the Ironman finish line that you mentioned. And those stories, that story was pretty powerful. That was hugely transformative for me, because at that point I had going back to my background with everything that I was witnessing out in the world, I didn't realize that I was a natural activist being birthed. But because I really didn't like what I was seeing out there, I became an activist for animals and for the earth. And my activism was really driven by rage. It was driven by pain. It was driven by anger. And it wasn't sustainable. I think that that's where a lot of activists burn out, is that unhealed pain. And I was no different from anyone else in that respect, because I was just projecting all of that rather than allowing myself to really just feel it all. I was just projecting it out onto others. And what I realize now, looking back on my activism, is that what I was doing is I was creating more of what I wanted to see ended, and separation, because I was just creating division from the other side of the fence. Right. So my activism was getting more and more inflamed because, when you go down the rabbit hole, it's endless. And there's just so much ugly stuff. You start seeing everything, the human injustices, animal injustices, environmental injustices, and it's endless, the cruelty on this planet. So it wasn't until the death of my mother in 2010, which was it was sudden, it wasn't expected. And I was really forced then to face myself head on. She and I had a really close relationship. In many ways, she was more like a friend than a mother. And she left, as far as I'm concerned, prematurely. But of course, now, after having done so much work, I understand how all the pieces, the puzzle pieces in my life are starting to fit together. Mm-hmm. Really, in that one fleeting moment, it was life as I knew it just ended. And I was denied the chance to say goodbye to her. So I had to learn how to create closure for myself. Her whole death was really messy and complicated. Without getting into the minutia of the story, there was a man involved. My father had already died long before that, but this man was making things very difficult for my sisters and I. And again, I had to learn how to make peace, and I had to learn about forgiveness. It was really, really unpleasant. And I learned what a death in denial looks like. And it was not pretty, and it was really painful. And it was not an ending I ever would have predicted for my mother and I. And, it's just, considering the relationship that we had, it was really shocking to me. And because my father was already 11 years predeceased, it meant that I was now an orphan. And it totally altered my sense of identity. I became the matriarch in my family because I have two younger sisters. Mm-hmm. And it was a really weird, paradigm shift for me. And I felt really lost. So during that same time, I was compelled to do an Ironman triathlon. Now, I was already a triathlete at that time, so it's not like I just got it into my head to jump off the couch one day and do an Ironman. But the timing honestly made no logical sense. But what was really powerful inside, it was an impulse inside of me that was greater than me, that was moving me onward to do this thing. So the intense physical training, and it is intense, became a needed diversion to really subdue the agonizing grief and the rage and the betrayal and the despair that was really percolating inside of me. It distracted me so that I didn't feel totally overwhelmed by it. So essentially, Ironman really became the ideal kind of mind-body distraction to ignite a future perfect storm, which I'll get into. Mm-hmm. And when I was actually training for Ironman, every training session felt like I was carting around a backpack full of boulders. That's the only way that I can describe it. Mm-hmm. And they were getting heavier and heavier as I kept denying my grief.
Yeah.
And I was so regularly injured. This is how the grief was manifesting with me. It was manifesting as physical injuries, that only twice was I actually able to run a half marathon distance in my training. And leading up to an Ironman, athletes are supposed to get up to close to marathon distance, if not marathon distance, because an Ironman ends with a marathon. So I was so injured that I was never able to take a step beyond a half marathon. So I knew that I was underprepared going to the start line, and I knew that it was going to hurt. But because I had turned my Ironman effort into a fundraiser for Farm Sanctuary, which is a farm animal rescue charity in New York that's really close to my heart, I knew that I couldn't let the animals down. And I knew that I also couldn't let down the people who believed enough in me to donate to this cause. So that higher purpose really spurred me on. And I barely remember race day. For most people, it's one of the most memorable experiences of their lives. But for me, it was about getting it done, because I think that I was already reaching a subconscious threshold where something big was going to change. And when I crossed the finish line, rather than feeling ecstatic about the whole thing and celebratory, I was struck with such a profound sense of emptiness that even talking about it 5 years later now, I can still feel it inside. It was so profound. And it was quite frightening because it was so foreign.
Mm.
And I didn't care what I just accomplished. I didn't care about it at all. There was no attachment. I just wanted to go back to my little cabin and be left alone. And what happened afterwards was a full-on dark night of the soul. And I didn't have the language for it then, but I do now after having gone through it. I fell into such a profound abyss of depression that I could barely care for myself. I couldn't get out of bed. I didn't want to eat. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't function. It was like this really bizarre paralysis that felt like, it just felt really dark. I actually can mentally feel like it felt confining, and it felt really dark.
Mm-hmm.
6 weeks, I was trapped in that darkness. And quite honestly, to this day, I don't really know what shifted. I just know that it felt like somebody took a tiny pin and poked a hole in this shroud of darkness.
Mm.
And that pinprick of light was just enough. It was what I needed really to shake myself out of that heavy, dense, paralyzing fog of depression. And it was just enough light for me to ask myself, like, what the hell am I doing? Where's my passion? Where's my joie de vivre? Where did they go?
Mm.
Then the most important question that came up for me was, who am I?
Yeah.
And that question is what spawned a really epic journey of self-discovery.
Mm.
So that really is what led me on this path, because I started going to workshops and retreats. All of it was internally guided. As soon as I said, like I said earlier, as soon as I said yes to myself, then all of a sudden it was like the inspiration flooded to me.
Mm.
Go here, do this, do this, do this, do this. And that's exactly what I did. So I studied NLP, became a master practitioner, thinking that I was going to use it for the athletes I was training.
And that's neuro-linguistic programming, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. I had no idea that it was going to be so healing for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that really gave me a solid foundation for understanding the mind more.
Right.
I studied consciousness and yogic philosophy and human essence. Everything was on an experiential level. So as I was studying this, I was experiencing it and going through my own healing at the same time. And when through this, I ended up going to a place called the Monroe Institute, and that was quite an experience. Not something I don't think I ever would have cognitively thought to go there, but I was internally guided to go there, and that really expanded my whole concept of consciousness. And that's when I realized on a deep, visceral level, like beyond my cognitive mind, that there's only one absolute in life, and that's death. And when I made peace with that inevitable reality, it made room for so much more life. It just expanded my life force that much more, and really connected me to the sacredness of life, the sacredness of every moment. And all of a sudden I realized, why the hell am I waiting to be a writer? There's an author that's been wanting to be birthed inside of me since I was a child.
Right.
And all of a sudden my life just blew wide open. Everything that I was doing to suppress myself, all of a sudden it fell away. And, this deeper connection to my own life, also, it inspired me to simplify my life. So I moved across the country. I moved from Ottawa to where I now live here in coastal BC, so I could be closer to nature. I do work that feeds my soul and inspires others. I don't have much of a bank account, but my heart is full. My partner and I live with our 3 dogs and our 4 cats, and we have a beautiful organic garden in our little rented bungalow. We shop on Craigslist when we need anything, or we build things out of found wood or reclaimed wood. And we've created a wonderful community, which I think is really, really important, of like-hearted souls who I feel safe with. And we trade garden goodies and we trade wisdom. And for me, it's a wonderful life. And this all happened out of death. So really, death inspired life for me. And it's been really profound. But I also learned about, you were asking about grief. And that has become one of my favorite words as well. Not necessarily one of my favorite experiences, but I intimately know the profound wisdom in grief. And I've realized that grief is the flip side of love. And if we refuse grief, we refuse love. And I think that we can all agree that in our pain-phobic culture of denial and pharmaceutical pain suppression, that love is almost like an endangered species. And my belief is that we must grieve. And I get very passionate about this. We must grieve if we're ever to become whole. And if we're ever to access our love for the world and for ourselves, we have to grieve, because we live in a world where self-loathing prevails, and it shows up in so many dysfunctional ways, like self-worth issues, self-hatred, and even narcissism. I feel like that's a manifestation of self-loathing. And how can we ever begin to love the world if we don't even love ourselves, if we despise ourselves? I mean, it makes no sense. So all of this pain and grief that is pushed out of our consciousness with our busyness, our workaholic mindsets, and the endless distraction in our culture is just really creating more disconnect. But I know you and I both know that pain finds ways to leak out if it's not expressed, and it comes out in addiction and anxiety and depression and rage and stress and passive aggressive behavior and, so many other emotionally immature expressions. I mean, that's the only way I can really describe it. And then, of course, the body is the last frontier. Like for me, it was injuries during Ironman. When I wasn't expressing my grief, it turned into injuries. And for others, it can be tumors or any kind of illnesses.
Well, I found your story of depression and that dark night of the soul time so interesting for that very reason, because my friend Francis Weller, who wrote The Wild Edge of Sorrow and is, I consider, the grief sage in the United States, talks about depression as unmetabolized grief. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that you had to go through that experience in order to break through your grief, to your grief. And I could not agree more in terms of activists and the need for activists to grieve. And so many activists have resistance to that. Mm-hmm. They want to stay with the fire and passion, which, as you say, guarantees that you will burn out. And, activists are often afraid to come near the grief because it's going to make them woozy, or they're just going to roll over and give up. When in fact, my experience with grief is that it's made me more passionate. It's made me more alive. And absolutely, it is inextricably connected with love. Grief is love. Love is grief. And the more compassionate I become as I experience that grief. And I'm sure you have had a similar experience.
Oh, absolutely. I wholeheartedly believe, and again, here's my passion. I wholeheartedly believe that if everyone allowed themselves to be ripped apart, just ripped apart by the overwhelming grief that they carry. And I believe that we all carry it, all of us, for the childhood we'd never had, love, relationships lost, even jobs lost, animals, humans who left too early. It's all there. I mean, there is so much grief in every single one of us, but I believe that if we just allowed ourselves to be taken over by it, that we would emerge like the phoenix from the ashes, filled with love and compassion and a deeper connection to our own essence, and by default then a deeper connection to the essence of all other living beings. And I also believe that if we weren't such a pain-phobic culture, and if we allowed the full expression of our deepest core wounds to be expressed, I truly believe that we never would be in this mess right now that we're collectively in. Because you and I know that grief, it rips the heart open, and it makes space for intense love, passionate love, and that passionate love that we carry for the world. And it reminds me of grief. It reminds me of the frailty and the sacredness of life. Every time I grieve, as much as it sucks when I'm in it, I know that on the other side of it, I'm going to come out more whole, more passionate, and more vibrant. And it makes me think of a Joanna Macy quote that I just love. And it is, the heart that breaks open can contain the whole universe.
Yes.
And
yes.
as far as I'm concerned, that says it all.
Well, some people are able to be ripped apart, as you were, and very much on your own. But other people, find that really scary, or they don't really have the resources to do that. That's one reason that I do grief weekends, grief weekend workshops, which I'm going to be doing another one in Chico, California in October, because this provides a safe, supportive container where people are actually supported and thanked for doing their grief work rather than shamed and rejected as we experience in our culture. So thank you for all that you've shared there about your own personal grief story. And, I want to continue talking more about death, which you started to get into. On your website, you speak of death as being a powerful motivator, and it's obviously been part of your transformation and evolution. Anyone who allows themselves to be fully awake to the catastrophe of climate change is invariably confronted with death, the death of ecosystems, the death of species, and of course one's own death. And I don't believe there's ever been a time in human history when we have talked as much about death as we're talking about it now. And I anticipate that as species extinction worsens, we're going to be talking about it a lot more. So how are you dealing with or dancing with death these days?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, I just want to back up to one of the things that you said about the grief workshops that you're doing. You said something about creating a safe container, and I just want to stress the importance for safety. I'm really glad that you said that word, because again, this comes back to our pain phobic culture.
Right.
Most of us don't feel safe expressing our pain and our grief, because it's often shut down by others.
Right.
Oh, get over it, or whatever they say, And so safety is key to be able to express that. So going back to your question about dealing or dancing with death. Well, sometimes I don't deal or dance with it at all very well. Yesterday was one of those days.
Right.
I knew that I had a grief day, and I was not dealing with it well. But that's just, part of the human experience. So I am not immune from the despair of my own heartache. And I wouldn't want to be. Because again, it reveals to me how much I love this planet. Mm-hmm. And I find that when I fall into despair, it's often when I start filling my head with too much information. Mm-hmm. Or if I allow myself to engage in meaningless conversations, which I don't do very often, but sometimes if I go swimming, I'm at the pool, I have a conversation with a lifeguard who's in denial. I feel irritated when I get in for my swim. So I have to learn how to protect myself better from that.
Right.
I'm going to say this right up front, I'm not a huge fan of Newtonian science. As far as I'm concerned, Newton is one of the patriarchal founding fathers of the paradigm of separation.
Right.
Newtonian science has separated us from our bodies, from the web of life, and from our souls. And as a result, we see everything from a cause and effect linear point of view, which is exactly the opposite of life, because life is nonlinear and it's often chaotic in its naturally intelligent way. So Newtonian science negates that nonlinear, immaterial, energetic, all of those ways of the universe, which is kind of why I lean more towards the Einsteinian point of view, mm-hmm. which is about energy. But anyways, I'm digressing there. So when I start feeding my intellect with too much scientific information, I derail. And that happens with 100% certainty. But that said, I also find it interesting how science is now aligning with what's going on inside of me, with my intuition, with what I'm feeling. And that's alarming. Now, the thing about science is that it's not inspiring. It's just information, which remains trapped in my head. And I know that science really doesn't inspire others, because we've known the science for years and nobody does anything. It's just the business as usual. People don't act. They don't act with what they know. I feel like people act with how they feel. And information rarely sinks down to the heart, certainly not in my case anyway. So when I read or listen to scientific reports, I fall into despair. And the only way out for me is to cut myself off from that stuff. And I just don't do well with the minutia of content when I can already feel what's going on. So when I find myself derailing, it's important for me to reclaim my essential nature by dropping into my heart. And I do this by stepping into my grief, if that's what's coming up.
Right.
And I let it have me. So this goes back to the grief conversation. But ultimately for me, the most profound way for me to dance with death is time in nature. And that has been with me all of my life. Nature is the ultimate healer for every one of my fears or my worries, my wounds, all of it. So I very intentionally moved to a geographical location where I could be immersed in nature with mountains and rainforests and ocean and wildlife. This is my lifeline to sanity. And also another lifeline to sanity is my house full of animal companions. I know you have a dog, and they're so loving and they're so goofy. And if I find myself, feeling teary or upset about something, I have Francis. He's my canine soulmate. I have 3 dogs, but Francis in particular, he and I have a really close connection. And I call him my grief relief and my joy boy. He just snaps me right into the present moment. And, he reminds me of my own essence, because he and all of the animals in my life, well, all animals, they live permanently in their own essence. I can be sitting by the ocean and a dragonfly or a butterfly or an eagle will fly by, and that alone will snap me back into my essence if my mind is starting to worry or wander. Animals really humble me, and again, they always have, just because they live in their essence. I used to have a consistent meditation practice, and I still do meditate. But it seems to be more of a semi-regular thing now. It just naturally fell away on its own, and it's been replaced more by contemplation. And when I talk about contemplation, it's when I'm out in nature, and I'm sitting with my dogs, usually, because they're with me. And it's about sitting and not thinking. It's about just being present in whatever surrounding that I'm in, and just allowing any kind of internal guidance to come through, or nothing, if that's the case.
Right.
Really just feeling my humanity. To me, that's what contemplation is. So, and it's getting more challenging because, there's more ugly stuff that's happening out in the world. And so I'm learning how to hold the beauty and the ugliness at the same time. So, looking out at the ocean and seeing the beauty of, Vancouver Island off in the distance, and the ocean, of course, and then seeing a tugboat go by trailing whatever you call those containers full of gravel that I know have been raked from a mountain nearby.
Right.
So how do I hold that? I'm learning how to hold the two together, that dichotomy. And that is part of, I guess, my spiritual experience, spiritual connection, and reminds me again of the sacredness of life. So that helps me dance with death. So I think that ultimately really what it is just staying very closely connected with nature in all aspects of the natural world, the beautiful and the ugly.
I want everyone to know that today I'm talking with Deb Ozarko, cultural revolutionary, status quo crusher, wannabe dancer, Ironman triathlon finisher, unapologetic vegan, voracious seeker of truth, radical critical thinker, and passionate lover of life, whose work you must read about at debozarko.com. That's spelled debozarko.com. So listeners, are you enjoying this podcast and my conversation with Deb Ozarko? Are you appreciating that the new Lifeboat Hour can bring you this kind of quality programming on a weekly basis and provide inspiration and tools for navigating these turbulent times? If so, I'd really appreciate your support in the form of a donation to the podcast each time you listen or download. Wherever you link to the podcast, whether it's on my website at carolynbaker.net or on Podbean, please show your appreciation by contributing and helping us continue for this quality programming for you on this podcast every week. As I say each week, I do this work for you, my friends, and for all living beings. Today I'm talking with Deb Ozarko, and Deb, you live on the Sunshine Coast of just a bit north of Vancouver in British Columbia, right? Tell us where.
It is a beautiful strip of land on the mainland. So it feels like I live on an island, but it's north of Vancouver, 40 minutes by ferry, or I think 20 minutes by float plane. And you can only access it by ferry or float plane or private boat. Because of the geography here, because of the channels of water in the mountains on one side. So it has a really nice isolated feel to it.
Well, one of the things that riveted me to your website and compelled me to contact you immediately is your use of the words passion and purpose to describe how you wish to live at this dire, daunting, and often discouraging time in history. So I'd like you to talk about passion and purpose and how you feed those in your life and what counsel you have for people listening who may feel less connected with them than you do.
That's an easy one for me. You might be able to gather, I'm a naturally passionate person. It just comes naturally. And so, I know that it's not always so easy for others, because I think for me, it's just because I never said yes to the cultural conditioning.
Right.
And when we say yes to it, it deadens us. So for me, passion and purpose come so easily because I love life so much. I love this planet. I love animals. I love the natural world. I love learning through personal experiences. I love having conversations like you and I are having. This is what feeds me.
Right.
And, I love having interactions with elders who can help me become more of who I'm meant to be. And in my life, that's usually animals.
Right.
There's been humans as well that have inspired me, but animals are the greatest gurus in my life.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how I feed my passion and my purpose is by being 100% unapologetically myself.
Mm.
And what I'm learning is how to do that with grace, because I'm not always graceful. So that's an ongoing practice, is to learn the grace, because sometimes I blurt out what's going on inside. And that goes back to my activism. I'm still deconditioning myself from that activist rage persona.
Mm-hmm.
It's deeply embedded in who I am, but it's so much better now. So being myself with grace, and in being 100% Deb Ozarko, flaws and all, I'm guided from within to do what my heart tells me is right. Again, that goes back to what I said earlier about saying yes to ourselves. Like, by saying yes to myself, like, passion and purpose just comes so easily. And because I'm so internally referenced, it's also really easy. But what isn't always easy is living in this toxic culture that's so money driven. So I've had to access my own sense of resilience and creativity and discover ways to make it work so that I can pay the rent and other basic living expenses.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll admit that it really pisses me off that we're all enslaved by this culture.
Right.
But what I've learned and what I continue to learn, again, this is an ongoing evolutionary process, is that there are ways to minimize the grip that it has on us. And I've always been willing to sacrifice what others may call comfort or necessity so that I can honor my heart. For instance, one of the things that really bugs me is so many people complain about having no money, and yet they cart around an iPhone. Now, I know an iPhone is a money pit. And nobody needs it. They've just bought into an expensive illusion. And I don't own a cell phone. I don't own an iPhone. I don't own any of that stuff because to me, it's not important. I'd rather have real conversations. I'd rather have real interactions and be connected. So that to me is just one of the things that, I'm just disconnected from that stuff. That's not a necessity for me. And I keep my life as distraction free as possible. I'm not on Facebook. I haven't owned a TV since 1995. I choose my relationships carefully and I don't compromise my heart. Like that to me is the most important thing. So it's all about intentional choices. I eat a whole food vegan diet to honor my connection to life and to honor the love that I have in my heart for animals. I no longer compete in triathlons, but I'm very disciplined. I have an athletic background, so the athlete never leaves. So I'm disciplined with my self-care, but I'm flexible too. So I'm not really rigid with my life. So I exercise every day. I'm in nature every day. I sleep when I need to. If I need a nap midday, I'll do it. And I've set my life up so that I can do that. And this is what helps me live a more purposeful life, is all of this self-care. And I do what feeds my heart, and I refuse to compromise that. So it may not be financially lucrative by cultural standards, or it doesn't come with the fancy trappings of Western civilization. But to me, that's not what life is all about. To me, life is so short. And that was really, really, it became very pronounced for me with the death of my mother. Life is so short that, we need to seize the moment. And now with everything that's playing out in the world with abrupt climate change, I'm feeling like life is that much shorter. So, for me, it's all about intentional choice. And I know that most people in our culture make repeated unconscious choices that are based on patterns and cultural conditioning. And then they live as victims to those choices. So they live in what I call a perpetual state of PMS, which is poor me syndrome. And I'm all about self-ownership. And that is the only way to evolve. So my belief is that people only feel less connected to passion and purpose when they let antiquated beliefs run the show. So what I'm talking about, is they'll have the voice of their father or their mother constantly droning on in the background of their heads. And they also don't question anything. So there's no critical thought.
Right.
I question everything, especially if it's a prevailing worldview. And I have a voracious curiosity. So, and also I'm really connected to my body. So if you want to be connected to passion and purpose, what I've learned is that we have to get out of our heads. We have to slow down. We have to breathe. And in our culture, most people don't even know how to breathe properly, for crying out loud. And that is the only way that we can feel. And I stress the word feel. I get really passionate about this. The continual messaging of the body. And I think that brings me back to grief again. So it's always like, it seems like a full circle conversation all the time.
Yes.
Most people can't feel what's going on in their bodies because they've locked down their pain from the years and years of mental and cultural conditioning. And when we negate our pain, we negate the reclamation of our wholeness. And when we negate our wholeness, we negate our passion and our purpose. And as a result, I think that most people just live in a perpetual state of fear and low self-worth. So they don't think that they're worth their passion, the passion that wants to move through. They don't think they're worthy of the purpose that is desperate to be expressed. So for me, pain and grief are not only the gateways to love, they're also the gateways to passion and purpose. And I truly believe that all we need to do is step into our pain and our grief, and voila, there it is. There's all the wisdom. There's the, I'm going to use the title of your book, Dark Gold. There's the dark gold right there.
Right.
Our passion, our purpose, our love for life, and our love for the world. It's right there in our pain. So this is a topic I get really passionate about, and I can go on all day about people just getting over themselves and stepping into their pain so that they stop acting out as lifeless destroyers of their own lives and of everything else out there in the world, and just really step into the passion and the compassion and the gold that's right there on the other side of that grief and pain. So, yeah, I could go on with this all day, but I believe that pain and grief are the gateways to our love for the world. And that feeds our passion, and that just presents to us our purpose on a silver platter.
Well, what you've described in the last few moments is a life unplugged from a lot of aspects of our culture. And you've written what looks like a powerful book called Unplug. And on your website, you say that, quote, unlike many spiritually oriented books, Unplug does not veil the darkness with blind faith. It explores the grief, pain, anger, frustration, and despair that come from bearing witness to the stark realities of our current times, and it celebrates the hope and possibilities that emerge from living authentically with passion, presence, and purpose. So I wonder if you'll tell us why you wrote the book and what you hope for its impact.
I wrote the book because I was finally guided from within to get over myself. This goes back to my answer from the last question.
Right.
Get over myself and claim the author within. And she had a heck of a lot to say.
Right.
Book number 2 is on its way. So the book starts with my observations of the disturbing world that we're living in, and leads into a condensed version of my story and how I claimed the fullness of my passion and presence and purpose, which is ongoing. And this then led me to explore how others discovered and claimed their own sense of passion and presence and joy and love for the world. And that really fed my voracious curiosity. Every single person in the book was intuitively guided, and all of the stories differ. But the one thing that is really cool is that there's a common thread in every single one of the stories. And that was, again, going back to my previous answers, that pain was the gateway to purpose. So I guess the impact that I'm hoping for is in the reader is a pattern interrupt that snaps them out of their cultural conditioning and implores them to question the status quo, question their behaviors, question their choices and their actions, and reclaim more of their essential nature. And when I speak about essential nature, I'm really talking about our hearts, that the passion that's inside, and just to really live beyond the cultural conditioning that is so deeply ingrained in every one of us. And so I do this by sharing the stories of others who, like I said, I was intuitively guided to connect with. And they've done just that. So the power of story is intense. I mean, when we read or hear the story of someone else, it brings out aspects of our own selves in that story. And this is why personal story has been so powerful throughout centuries. I know that indigenous cultures and so many different cultures have used story as a way to convey really powerful messages. And so these are just personal stories, and it's having a big impact on readers. And, the Amazon reviews and the emails I've been receiving from readers confirm that it really is making a difference in their lives. And that was what I was hoping for. I'm not hoping to convert anybody or change anybody. I'm just hoping that when people read the stories, they will see aspects of themselves and be inspired to live more fully. And, it's really interesting because a lot of the people in the book are people I've admired for quite some time. Some of them I thought were untouchable. And, people like Sean Korn, who I've admired her activism through her use of the yoga philosophy for years and years. Barbara Marx Hubbard, some of these people, I thought, how am I ever going to get close to them? I would get an intuitive hit to connect with these people. And I'm like, how is this going to happen? But again, going back to what I said earlier, is when we say yes to ourselves, at least, I'm speaking from my own personal experience. When we say yes to ourselves, then doors open that you could never imagine would open. And I write about all of these experiences in the book. And so I'm now deep in the throes of my second book, which is coming along much faster than the first one because I've said yes.
And just give us a little taste of what that book is about.
I think the working title right now will probably say it all. It's, I have to remember now, The Time for Planetary Hospice, Living Fully, Loving Hard, and Letting Go of a World in Collapse.
Oh, I love it. I absolutely love it. Well, everyone must run out and get Unplug on Amazon, your local bookstore, Unplug by Deb Ozarko. And you've also written, Deb, an amazing article recently. Your most recent article talks about freedom from hope. And you call hope denial and drag. And I'd like you to explain this and talk about why grief and love are much more authentic and useful for us personally and for the planet than hope.
Yeah, this essay that I just put out in May was a huge paradigm shift for me. I was already starting to feel like I was questioning the authenticity of my work earlier this year, and I didn't know what that meant. Things were just not feeling right, but I couldn't really pinpoint it. And then I started having premonitions. I'd be just falling asleep, and I would start having these premonitions. And I've had premonitions all of my life, and I'll get into this a little bit later, but they were about the state of the ocean. Mm. And that really they were pivotal for the release of this essay. And really inspired me to go really deep within and look at what's going on inside. And when I said yes to that, all of a sudden the words started to flow. And that's what this essay was all about. And what I discovered through writing this essay is how hope is like a ball and chain around both feet, and how it prevents us from really living more authentically, as authentically as we possibly can. I had no clue. I have been a very hopeful person for most of my life. And yes, I do fall into despair like anybody who cares. But there was always a glimmer of hope somewhere that pushed me with my activism. Now, when I wrote this thing, it was really profound for me to realize how hope was really a burden. So I realized that hope is denial and drag. And my belief is that hope is just another distraction in our self-serving, narcissistic selfie culture that prevents us from facing the severity of what we as a species have collectively created, of the damage we've imposed on the biosphere, and of our collective separation from the web of life. So to me, hope is just another excuse to carry on with the same old, because it unloads the burden of personal responsibility in the present moment and sugarcoats it with a future illusion. And when we liberate ourselves from hope, then we have to be fully present. And in that, then we have to take ownership, which means that we can no longer deny what's playing out in the world. And we can't deny our own role in the creation of this beast. And so I had to face my own denial. When I realized what hope really was, at least from this, this epiphany that came to me, I had to face my own denial. I had to face where I was contributing to this paradigm of separation, and how it was slowing me down from living even more purposefully. So, when we stop hoping, it's liberating, and it is, it applies to every aspect of our lives, not just with what's playing out in the world. So no hope equals presence. And, this goes back to that word that I just used. I mean, this is liberating because we're no longer denying reality. And that's why hope is denial and drag to me. And when we release hope, we can then look at the present moment with clarity and with honesty. And from there, we can make more informed decisions and choices. And when we hope, we're wishing and we're pretending that everything is okay. And to me, that's just denial. When we stop wishing and pretending and hoping, we empower ourselves with presence. And the present moment is truth. And that present moment, in that present moment, we feel our grief, our love, our joy, all of it. So again, going full circle. And that's just like what Eckhart Tolle says in The Power of Now. And, you know, one of the things that I wrote in my essay, I'm just going to pull this up here.
Sure.
Okay. When we hope, it's not enough. But when we're present, it's more than enough. In our presence, we're activated. We show up in ways that allow us to discover ever more capacity to love this world. The biggest gift we can offer the world is our full-on activated presence. And I feel like it's only activated. Our presence is only activated by our deepest authenticity, and that comes from our grief and our love.
Mm-hmm. So you can read Deb's article on hope and giving up hope on her website, debozarko.com, and on my website, carolynbaker.net. I have to say, Deb, that was probably the best description and explanation of why we need to release hope that I have ever heard.
Thank you.
So I thank you for that. And Deb, thank you so much for being on the new Lifeboat Hour today for what is your first, but absolutely not your last appearance here. I trust you know that. I feel a profound kinship with you in our work in the world, and I look forward to many more conversations with you here on this podcast and in other locations in cyberspace. Thank you for your work in the world. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Carolyn, for your work in the world, and thank you for the honor of having me on your show.
So, listeners, until next time, be well, be safe, and be awake.
Thank you for joining us today. You can hear all podcasts and learn about Carolyn Baker's other works at www.carolynbaker.net. Her daily news digest is available by subscription and is delivered to your inbox 7 days per week with real news on economics, environment, geopolitics, civil liberties, and cultural issues, plus links to articles on inspiration and resilience. Come sail with us again next week on the Lifeboat Hour.